Okay, so good morning, and thank you for this invitation. It's honestly an honor to be here among some of the top scholars in the world. So, who've inspired my work over the years, and so it's a great opportunity. What I'm going to be speaking about is timing in conflict resolution, and timing, of course, is something that I think it receives too little attention, and it's often plays a huge role for you hear many scholars, practitioners, and policymakers saying, we cannot interfere here, the timing is not right, we need to wait for some other opportune moment. We all are probably quite familiar with Zartman, and the ripeness theory is the most prominent theory that deals with the issue of timing. And essentially it argues that parties can only resolve conflict when they are ready to do so. When their alternatives are blocked, let me just... and when they have reached a mutually hurting stalemate. He argues that ripeness is a necessary but insufficient condition. And the mutual hurting stalemate is essentially a lose-lose scenario, right? It's a perception that neither side can win and the conflict is harmful. So ripeness comes when there's a perception of a harmful situation and a way out. So there's been some scholarly debate on this. Part of it has to do with the hurting stalemate situation, and part of it is, or much of it has been on the lack of ripeness is used as a justification for inaction, and there's also been discussion over or questioning the motivation for the leadership to end conflicts, and an assumption, an overall assumption that at some point leaders will or groups will reach a point of ripeness. It's also these studies, or this theory is based in a cost-benefit rational choice analysis. So it has sort of presumptions that parties or the leadership will do what's best for them. And of course, we know from experience or from looking at conflicts that leaders may not necessarily be benevolent or be a representative of their group, or certainly not the whole group. Okay, so I'm just gonna. Okay, so my question is whether ripeness is an appropriate and relevant factor for mediators in an ongoing intractable conflict. And I would like to suggest that there are some serious problems with the theoretical approach and our continuous use of it, both as scholars as well as practitioners. I think first, some of these intractable conflicts are decades-old. Group identities are entrenched in a way that they're very difficult to change. Conflicts are quite, many of these conflicts are asymmetric conflicts, so that one of the groups will never reach this painful experience, so you're not going to get to mutual painful experience. And there's also the red lines to consider in terms of intervention. Since 2005, we have the responsibility to protect norms. And this is the heads of states agreed on certain red lines that passes genocide. So now in case of war crimes, genocide, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity, the international community has the responsibility to take action to protect the population. So I think this is another consideration that has to be taken about to be thought about when one is considering ripeness. The other aspect of it is related to issues that address things happening within the country and then outside. The theory is very much based on domestic issues, on the endogenous factors. So it's based on the local leadership when the groups reach a mutual hurting stalemate, the readiness of the group to reach compromise, the realities of the ground. Whereas I think a lot of the timing in terms of effective intervention is more related to the exogenous or the external factors. We can talk about the time, or we can examine the time when the external interveners reach a consensus, decide on what are the appropriate actions and tools, we know from also quantitative studies that the worst possible type of intervention is when intervention takes place on behalf of opposing sides that we know escalates the conflict. And so the relevancy of waiting for the ripeness to happen is quite questionable also, because we know from looking at conflicts that early intervention will mitigate an expansion of the conflicts. Once again, powerful side will never reach a hurting stalemate. And the leadership that we're looking at will perhaps is, and it's quite common, is gaining politically, economically, from the conflict, and following a resolution is likely to lose power. So the motivation for the leadership is quite questionable. And the marginalized part of the population, once again, tends to be vulnerable and may not be represented by the leadership. So what I do is I look at this in 4 case studies, 2 that you can argue have been more or less resolved, and 2 that are not resolved. Okay, sorry. So the Bosnia case, it's I mean, we can sort of get into the depthness of the case if it's possible within the question and answer period, but it's certainly very relevant in terms of responsibility to protect, in that there was war crimes, genocide, ethnic cleansing from 1992, concentration camps, rape camps, and so on. Very much an asymmetric conflict. And in the end, the international community created these safe havens that were not safe. And it was essentially also a regional proxy war. The intervention, the ripeness was not really a factor in ending the conflict. And I don't think there was a point in time where the parties had reached or would reach any kind of a mutual hurting stalemate because of the deep asymmetry between the groups. The end of the conflict took place when it was the international community that decided was enough as enough. And there was a consensus on how to intervene and what tools to use. And there was a couple key factors, I think, that played a huge role. One was fear of Muslim extremism, and second was the mutual desire for both the United States and the EU to strengthen NATO, at the time a very defunct organization. So I'll spend just a couple of minutes on each case, even though I realize these are very complicated cases and there's much to be said. So in Northern Ireland, when there's a lot of the studies on the ripeness issues in Northern Ireland looked at the domestic issues. And I think that there is more of a case to be made about ripeness with, on the domestic case side, especially with regard to demographic shift and play a role in that. The writing was on the wall, and demographically, Northern Ireland was going to change in terms of its power relations. But I think the exogenous factors, factors outside, played a far deeper role. It was the regional proxy war that was fueling the conflict. And the withdrawal support from both London and Ireland left few options for either the nationalists or the unionists. Okay, Syria. Again, one of these conflicts that one can speak about for a long time, and we can discuss this more afterwards. The responsibility to protect is obviously or clearly very significant in the Syrian case. The red lines have been crossed in terms of war crimes, ethnic cleansing, crimes against humanity. Similar to the other conflicts, there's a huge external element to this. It's essentially a proxy war. To have a situation where you're waiting for a domestic elements which are very, very complicated is quite questionable. The proxy war between Saudi Arabia versus Iran, U.S. versus Russia and Turkey, Hezbollah, Al-Qaeda, you have a lot of actors on the ground which are trying to, we're trying to reach a consensus, but as we know, the effort has not been very successful. I look at in 2012 the 6-point plan for Kofi Annan. He worked hard to try and build a consensus between the external players, but there was a disagreement essentially over the timing of when Assad should leave, immediately or following some kind of election in 2014. And even though Assad essentially agreed to this plan, but he agreed to many plans which he never did, the international community was not able to reach a compromise between themselves on the tools or on the process. Israel-Palestine. Okay, thank you. Again, coming. Pardon? Yeah. Well, it's not a problem of stopping. It's a matter of where does one stop with this conflict? But it's another situation where, once again, you have war crimes, crimes against humanity, so responsibility to protect, I think, is quite relevant, protecting vulnerable populations. You have a situation, once again, it's a very asymmetric conflict, where the pain is really felt only by one side, minus a few, and the marginal population is the most vulnerable. So the minorities, women, and all other, and particularly people living in Gaza. Once again, the exogenous factors are highly, highly important. Most of the effort is always looking at Netanyahu and what's happening on the inside. But we all know that this is, in some ways, also a proxy conflict, in that there's a lot of financial, military, and diplomatic support that's fueling the conflict. And if you were to take that away, you'd have a very different conflict. So I think I would argue that ripeness is also not relevant in this case. It will never reach a mutually hurting stalemate, and politicians are not the ones suffering, as we know, but rather dependent on their conflict for their own positions. So you have a situation, I think, in at least these four conflicts that I looked at, and perhaps it would be interesting to look at more, or where ripeness, I would argue, is not terribly relevant. I mean, and timing can be perhaps as a matter of opportunity, but more in terms of opportunity in terms of days or weeks or possibly months, but certainly not years. So the mutually hurting reality is not is not really relevant. Potentially, to a small extent, within Northern Ireland domestic areas, but I think the external factors, I think, were far more important to ending the conflict. I work on external intervention also in other articles, I touch upon this issue more there, but I would tend to argue that an effective international intervention, or a good affecting tipping point, would come from when the international actors have reached a consensus on two fundamental issues. How to intervene. Do you intervene neutrally or in a partisan way? And what are the appropriate tools? As I mentioned before, if you intervene on the opposing side, you can have the greatest intention in the world, your intention may be to help and so on, you're going to escalate the conflict, right? Tools are only as effective as there is a consensus on them, right? And even Kofi Annan, that was part of the reason he resigned from the Syria mediation, was his tool was going to be just diplomacy, and his belief was, in a Syrian case, if we manage to get all of these, and this is why he was flying back and forth between Moscow and Ankara and Washington and so on during this process, in China, is if we manage to get the international community to agree on the principles, at the very least, and on how to intervene and on the right tools, then we can have the force of intervention. Otherwise, it's pointless. Oh, okay, thank you. And the other aspect, once again, international norms is another tipping point for intervention. And I think it's a very relevant one, even though the responsibility to protect is still a fairly new norm. It still needs to be integrated into policies of different states. But I think it's a very effective and powerful one. So as a conclusion, I think timing is important, but I think immediacy is more important than waiting for some time in the future, where the parties may reach some mutual hurting stalemate, which will never happen. And there's a greater need to focus on the outside factors. None of these conflicts take place in isolation. And the exogenous factors, if there is a united intervention, can be the most effective way out of these conflicts. Okay, I'll stop here. Okay.